Alright guys, this is part 5 of the WHAP reviews. You can see the voice is not holding up well, but I'm going to do what I can for you. Picking up where we left off last time, we're going to begin with China's influence on Korea, Japan, and Vietnam in a process known as Sinification. First place we're going to look at Sinification is Korea. It's a little bit different than Japan as we go forward because Korea was conquered by the Tang Dynasty for a little bit. And they decided, the Tang decided that it wasn't worth the trouble to keep it. So what they did is just pulled back and let them pay tribute and things like that. But what came in return of that is the influence on Korea, and that's all Sinification is Chinese influence on different places. What the Koreans did, the Silla dynasty, they brought cultural elements like Confucianism, writing, religion, which means Buddhism, fashion, and architecture. Next, we move to Japan and the Sinification that happened there. And the key thing to remember with this is that it's completely voluntary. All right, they did this on their own in a process called the Takai reforms. Once again, it's dealing with writing, bureaucracy, court life, belief systems, particularly Buddhism and Confucianism. Now, all the Sinification really comes to the forefront during the high-end era in Japan, where court life becomes incredibly luxurious, incredibly, I guess the word would be frivolous and stuff like that. And a lot of this is reflected in the world's first novel, which is A Tale of Genji by a woman named Lady Murasaki. So they're starting to focus a lot more on the luxurious aspects of court life and things, and not really concerned with running the country of Japan, or the region of Japan, I guess I should say. What this does is it leads to a loss of power because you start worrying about things other than what you should be, and a power vacuum ensues, and it leads to the rise of the shoguns, which leads to feudalism, and you need to be able to compare feudalism to that which existed in the Middle Ages, in the Middle Ages in Europe, and also the rise of the samurai. Your equivalent on that would be European knights. All right, now we move forward to everyone's favorite subject of the year, the Mongols. Let's see, as far as the main characteristics you need to know about these guys, number one, they're pastoralists, all right, which means they're completely tied to their animals. And in particular, the main one you need to know is the horse, and that thing's important for a couple of reasons. The main one is that the fact that you grew up on your horse. The skills that you learned growing up being a Mongol were very applicable to warfare. In other words, they were easily transferable. So all the things that you learned as you were growing up on how to hunt, how to ride a horse, how to maneuver, how to do whatever it is, when the war machine gets going, those skills are easily transferable over to it. You also need to know Genghis Khan, his process of step diplomacy, as we called it in class, also his psychological warfare, and most importantly, the tolerance of people who could help them. They weren't scared to bring in somebody with new ideas that would help them conquer other people. In other words, they didn't think they knew it all. They weren't scared to learn. And moving on down the line, be able to recognize a map of the dynasty at its height, and also be able to recognize Kublai Khan, who goes in and conquers China and forms the Yuan dynasty. And as far as the Yuan dynasty goes, be aware of the difficulties of ruling when you're a minority people, and also the separation he kept between the ethnic Chinese and the Mongols when they came in. Pax Mongolica is another characteristic of the Mongols, and it means Mongol peace. And that's what happens when they take over Central Asia and all the places that they did, is the fact that you can now travel the Silk Road without worry of being robbed or killed or anything like that. But there was a price to this peace. Number one, you see the disappearance of cities during this time because the Mongols, in some cases, and we talked about this in class, they could go all the way from just getting tribute if you surrendered to completely destroying your city. So they do this as part of their march across Asia. Also, the end of the Abbasid Empire due to the fall of Baghdad, and the incredible population loss that comes from it. I mean, they wiped out a lot of people, make no mistake about it, as they went on these campaigns, as they conquered all this land. So know that the peace characteristics and the trade-off of it. As far as the legacy of the Mongols, it was the largest empire in history up to this point. They also were okay with freedom of religion. They didn't really worry about it because they didn't feel like it was a threat to them. So they didn't care what you practiced or anything like that, as long as you got on board with what they were trying to do, as long as you weren't a problem, and as long as you paid tribute or whatever it was. They didn't care how you worshipped. Also, the increased trade that comes from the Pax Mongolica, and also the Black Death as it spreads across the protected Silk Roads and trade routes because of this Pax Mongolica, and eventually makes its way to Europe and wipes out a significant portion of the population. All right, next we roll to kingdoms in Africa, and you need to be able to differentiate between kingdoms in Africa that were under Muslim rule and those that were under Christian rule. So first we'll deal with the Muslim, and it's the ones that you've heard before. It's the Sudanic states of Ghana, Songhai, and Mali. Their biggest contributions obviously are trade items through the Saharan trade routes. Salt and gold being the two main ones, and also slavery ties into this a little bit as well. As far as the major cities that we already looked at, two of them are Timbuktu and Jenny. All right, the only empire in Africa during this period that has a Christian influence in it, that is originally a majority of Christian people, but gets I guess you could say knocked down a little bit as the expansion of Islam comes in, but still a significant Christian presence, is Ethiopia or the Kingdom of Axum. A couple of the characteristics: King Lalibela is the one that espouses the expansion of Christianity, also responsible for the rock churches, which you may see a picture of at some point. And as far as their economic characteristics, their major export at this time really is coffee, and the importance of that is that in Islam, obviously you can't drink alcohol, so coffee becomes kind of the stimulant, kind of the hanging out drink, I guess you could call it, of Islamic lands, and Ethiopia becomes important because of those coffee exports. All right, so now we move forward to we've talked about some of the political developments during this time period. Now we're going to switch over to the economic developments or advancements, or whatever you want to call it. And the first thing is new developments in agriculture and manufacturing. The first thing you need to be aware of and be able to tie this in: new crops and planting methods that come about during this time period lead to an increase in farm production, leads to an increase in population. Just draw the line like you always do. The two main crops in or the main aspects of this during this time. Number one is champa rice, which makes its way from Vietnam to China as a part of that Sinification that we talked about a while ago. There was a little bit of back and forth between China and these places, and the main one was this champa rice that comes back. Also, not to be confused, but kind of a similar word, is Chinampas agriculture in the Aztec Empire. Okay, and we talked about that. Those were the floating islands. Remember, Tenochtitlan, which was the capital city of the Aztecs, was located basically on a lake, and they didn't have a lot of arable or farmable ground around them, so they had to make do with what they had. And what they decided to do, or what they developed, was making floating islands on which they could put agricultural plots and be able to harvest and do everything from that. So be aware that these are the two things having to do with farming, or two main things having to do with farming during this time period. All right, so we move over to Western Europe and look at some of the advances in agriculture over there. There's really three main inventions you've got to know, or three main innovations you've got to know, and they're the horse collar, three-field system of crop rotation, and horseshoes. All these things, remember, and the bottom line on it, they lead to producing more food. The horse collar makes it easier, or makes a horse be able to pull a plow, which helps with the labor aspect of it. The three-field system of rotation, three-field system of crop rotation, allows you to get more from the land that you have. And then horseshoes, kind of the same thing. They help with animal power with agriculture. And here's kind of the bottom line on all these things. The main thing you need to know in relation to these is that what they do is they allow expenses to go down and farmers to produce more. And that's a pretty significant development because you can produce more food. And once again, more food equals longer lives equals more population. So be able to trace all those things kind of from their origin of when they came about to the results of it. Cause and effect, if you will. All right, so we roll on to the manufacture and export of products. In other words, talking about trade during this period, and look for some similarities or continuities and changes with these products from China. Still got, during this period, we've got ceramics, porcelains, and silk coming out. Persia, rugs, art, and silk, which they had learned how to produce it from the Chinese. India is cotton, and as always, these things are going through the Indian Ocean Network, and even though I don't have it on here, the Silk Roads as well. All right, from here we go to why cities declined and then revived. You see a loss in the number and the population of cities at the beginning of this time period, and then as we go, it begins to ramp up again. First, we'll deal with the decline of it. Obviously, the first reason for the decline of any kind of place would be depopulation. And this is particularly from barbarian invaders, and I'm looking I guess specifically again, at Rome when that happens. So you got depopulation. When depopulation happens, trade begins to decline, the economy uh, becomes hurt, and you combine that with diseases such as the plague that happened across Asia more at this time than in Europe, more at this period in Europe. Um, all these things lead to the decline of cities. All right, so after this period of decline, you then get the revival in cities, and you need to be able to kind of plot these things out as far as how this happened. First of all, you see new governments, and particularly in Europe, New and stronger governments leads to safer trade routes. Once that happens, you get more trade. This trade leads to more production because people now have a place to sell their goods. So more production leads to more jobs. So you have more people contributing to an economy. Also, on the agricultural front, which plays a part into it as well, climate change in the form of rising temperatures. And we'll look at this chart that you see right here, this graph right here in class, but there's a lot of climate change going on at this point. And remember, climate change doesn't mean 20, 30 degrees. It could be a tenth of a degree or even a hundredth in some cases. But the rise in temperatures means you can produce more food. So that plays once again into population, them needing products, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end of the Black Plague in Europe, towards the end of this time period, a lot of serfs begin to move to cities because they now have a sense of freedom, or they actually have freedom that they didn't have before, and they can kind of work in more ways than they could before. So all these things lead to the rise of cities, be able to go kind of from the beginning to the end. All right, so now we roll to labor, which we've looked at in every period up to this point, the continuity from the previous periods. We're still looking at, there's no industrial revolution yet. We're still looking at agriculture being the main form of labor everywhere in the world. And governments are still forcing workers to work on public works projects, still working on the Great Wall in China, also road networks in Europe and things like that. Now we start to see new types of agricultural labor because remember that's the main form of it. We start to see some changes. So we've looked at the similarities or the continuities, and now let's look at the changes. Forced labor becomes really I don't know, popularized. That's probably the bad word, but becomes more popular during this period. And there's three different forms that you need to be aware of. Number one is serfdom, or with serfs. The big characteristic about serfs, they're tied to the land. Doesn't matter who owns the land. It can transfer. They basically come with it. Okay, so they're associated or tied to it. Also, the Meta system with the Inca. Um, I'm sorry, I've got to look at my notes here. They're mainly used to build public works, like they're doing their agricultural work during certain periods or days of the week or the year, or whatever it is, but they owe certain service to the government. They'll be pulled off of their actual job to go work on roads, to go work on whatever it is. And then slavery. Now, we're not talking about American plantation slavery, but it is happening a lot of places around the world at this time. All right, so that wraps up part four of the WAP review. Granted, not my best effort, but I'm kind of playing hurt today. In the next one, we will begin with period four and keep on rolling along and hopefully get this done at some point.